They say the sky is the only place left where a man can die clean. Down in the mud of the trenches, death is filthy. It is a suffocating embrace of wet earth, mustard gas, and the rotting remains of the battalion that went over the top the day before. But up there, at 12,000 feet, the air is freezing and pure. When you die in the cockpit of an albatros, you are usually dead before you hit the ground. A bullet to the head, a fire in the fuel tank, a sheer drop into oblivion. It was supposed to be a night's war. A duel of skill and nerve between gentlemen who saluted each other before opening fire. That is the story they told the public back in Berlin. That is the story we told ourselves to keep from going mad. But by the spring of 1917, during the weeks the British would come to call Bloody April, we knew the truth. The sky wasn't empty, and it certainly wasn't clean. It was a graveyard of canvas and wood, and that April, we found out that something else was hiding in the clouds. Something that didn't care about the Kaiser, or the king, or the lines drawn on a map. It was simply watching us burn. I want you to put yourself in the cockpit of a German Albatros DD-3. It is April 1917. The technology you are strapped into is barely a decade old. You are sitting in a wicker chair, surrounded by plywood and fabric, with a 160 horsepower Mercedes engine screaming just a few feet in front of your face. The smell is a nauseating mix of exhaust fumes, cordite, and the castor oil used to lubricate the rotary engines, a smell that coats your throat and acts as a laxative if you swallow too much of the mist. You are freezing, because at this altitude the air is well below zero, and the wind chill on your exposed face feels like razor blades. You are hunting Englishmen, and you are terrified, not just of the enemy, but of the machine itself. These planes were fragile kites held together by wire and hope. A steep dive could tear your wings off. A stray spark could turn you into a falling torch. Peter knew all of this. He was a veteran wingman in Josta 11, the premier fighter squadron of the Imperial German Air Service. He had survived the winter, which in the life of a scout pilot made him an old man. He wasn't an ace. He didn't paint his plane in flashy colors or collect silver cups. His job was simple: guard the tail of the man who did. He flew on the right wing of the Rittmeister, the cavalry captain, the man the world would eventually know as the Red Baron. Flying formation with the Baron was the safest place in the war, and also the most dangerous. The British feared the red triplane, but they also focused every gun they had on it. That meant Peter spent most of his time looking backward, straining his eyes against the glare of the sun, waiting for the shadow of a British Sopwith Camel to fall across his leader's fuselage. It was a Tuesday morning patrol when the world first felt wrong. The Josta was prowling the sector above Douai, hunting for British reconnaissance planes. The cloud layer was thick that day, a heavy gray blanket at 6,000 feet that obscured the slaughter happening in the trenches below. Above the clouds, the sun was blinding. Peter was scanning the horizon, his head on a constant swivel. Check the sun. Check the tail. Check the leader. Repeat. The vibration of the engine was a constant physical assault, a numbness that started in the hands and worked its way up the arms. Then, the sound changed. At first, Peter thought his engine was misfiring. The roar of the Mercedes dropped in pitch, a subtle hesitation in the rhythm of the pistons. He glanced at his tachometer. The needle was steady. He looked over at the Baron's red Albatros flying 50 yards to his left. The Baron was flying straight and level, his scarf whipping in the slipstream. But then Peter felt it, a pressure in his ears, like the drop in altitude before a storm. The ambient noise of the wind and the engines seemed to be dampened, as if a heavy wool blanket had been thrown over the entire squadron. Peter looked up. Directly above them, perhaps 2,000 feet higher, something was hanging in the blue. It wasn't a cloud. It wasn't a bird, and it certainly wasn't a biplane. It was a disc, polished to a mirror sheen, reflecting the sun so intensely that it hurt to look at it. It didn't have wings. It didn't have a tail. It didn't have propellers. It was simply a silver scar on the sky, completely motionless. In 1917, the concept of a flying saucer didn't exist. There was no science fiction about little green men in the cinemas. To Peter, looking up through his oil-spattered goggles, the object was an impossibility. It defied every rule of aerodynamics he knew. Nothing could stay still in the air like that. Even the great zeppelins, the whales of the sky, drifted with the wind and hummed with the sound of massive engines. This thing was silent. It was fixed in space as if it were pinned to the firmament. Peter watched it for 10 seconds. He waited for it to fall. He waited for it to move. He tapped his machine gun triggers, just a quick burst to clear the ice, wondering if he should signal the flight lead. But before he could make a decision, the object vanished. It didn't fly away. It didn't accelerate into the distance. It just ceased to be there. One moment it was a solid, silver presence. The next, it was empty blue sky. The pressure in his ears popped. The roar of the engine returned to its full, deafening volume, and the patrol continued as if nothing had happened. Peter shook his head, blaming the hypoxia. The lack of oxygen at altitude played tricks on the mind. Men saw castles in the clouds. They saw the faces of dead friends in the mist. He forced his eyes back to the horizon, back to the war, back to the job of keeping the Baron alive. But his hands were gripping the control stick so hard his knuckles were white inside his leather gloves. He knew what he had seen, and he knew, with a primal sinking dread, that it had been watching them. When the squadron landed back at the aerodrome at Douai, the transition from the heavens to the earth was jarring. The airfield was a sea of mud. The ground crew ran out to catch the wings, guiding the fragile planes around the craters and puddles. As soon as the engine cut out, the silence of the ground rushed in. Not a true silence, but the absence of the engine's scream, replaced by the distant rhythmic thud of artillery pounding the lines 10 miles to the west. Peter climbed out of his cockpit, his legs stiff and numb. He pulled off his leather helmet and wiped the oil from his face with a rag that was already black with grease. He looked over at the Baron's plane. The Red Baron was already out, walking briskly toward the operations tent, his face set in a mask of concentration. He didn't look like a man who had seen a ghost. He looked like a man calculating fuel consumption and ammunition expenditure. Peter let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. Just a trick of the light, he told himself. Just the sun reflecting off an ice crystal. He walked toward the hangars where the mechanics were already swarming over the machines. This was the domain of Elias, the squadron's lead mechanic. Elias was a man who loved engines more than he liked people. He was older, with a face like crumpled leather and hands that were permanently stained with oil. He didn't care about the glory of the pilots. He cared about valve timing and tension wires. "She's running rough, Elias," Peter said, patting the fuselage of his Albatros. "Missed a beat up there around 12,000. Elias didn't look up from the engine cowling he was unlatching. "They're all running rough today, Lieutenant. Every single one of them." "Bad fuel batch?" Peter asked, reaching for a cigarette. "Not the fuel," Elias grunted. He stood up, wiping a wrench on his overalls. He looked around to make sure no officers were within earshot, then stepped closer to Peter. "It's the magnetos, the electricals. They're all haywire. The compasses are spinning like tops. I just pulled the plugs on the lieutenant's plane, and they're magnetized. My wrench sticks to the engine block like it's made of glue." Peter froze, the unlit cigarette hanging from his lip. "Magnetized? How?" "I don't know how," Elias snapped, clearly frustrated by a problem he couldn't hit with a hammer. Lightning strike, maybe. But we haven't seen a storm in 3 days. It's happening to the whole flight. The Baron's plane is the worst. His altimeter is stuck at 0, and his compass is pointing south no matter which way we turn the crate. It's like you boys flew through a magnetic field. Peter looked back up at the sky. It was a pale, innocent blue now, the clouds breaking up in the late afternoon. We didn't fly through anything, Elias. Just air. Well, the air did something to my engines, Elias muttered, turning back to the machine. You tell the Major that if he wants these birds up tomorrow, I need new magnetos. Or a priest. That evening, the mood in the mess hall was subdued. Usually, after a patrol with no losses, the wine would flow and the piano would be playing. But tonight, the exhaustion of the campaign was heavy in the room. Bloody April was grinding them down. They were losing pilots faster than they could replace them. Fresh faces would arrive from flight school in Berlin, eager and clean-shaven, and 3 days later their beds would be empty, their personal effects packed into a small wooden box to be sent home to a mother who still thought they were in training. Peter sat at a corner table, nursing a cup of coffee that tasted like chicory and mud. At the head table, the Baron sat with the other senior officers. They were discussing tactics, their hands moving in the air to mimic dogfights. But Peter noticed that the Baron wasn't eating. He was staring at the tablecloth, his eyes distant. It was like a lantern, a voice said. Peter turned. At the next table, a group of junior pilots were huddled together. The speaker was a boy named Lucas, who had only arrived at the front a week ago. He looked barely old enough to shave. His face was pale, his eyes wide and glassy. Keep your voice down, kid, one of the older pilots hissed. I'm telling you, Lucas insisted, his voice rising in pitch. I saw it. When we turned at the sector boundary, it was behind us. A bright light. It wasn't the sun. It was following me, like a lantern swinging in the dark, but it was broad daylight. The room went quiet. The conversation at the head table stopped. Every pilot knew the stories. They called them gremlins, or Foo Fighters, though that term wouldn't become famous until the next war. They were the spirits of dead aviators, or hallucinations brought on by stress. To admit seeing them was to admit that your nerve was cracking. And in the German Air Service, a crack in your nerve was a one-way ticket to the infantry. Major H stood up from the head table. He was the squadron's intelligence officer, a man who flew a desk and viewed the war through the lens of reports and statistics. He walked over to the junior table, his boots clicking on the wooden floorboards. Is there a problem here, Lieutenant? Major H asked, his voice smooth and cold. Lucas swallowed hard, standing up to attention. No, sir. Just reporting a sighting, sir. An unidentified aircraft. An aircraft, the major repeated. Did it have markings? Roundels? Crosses? No, sir. It was just light. Solid light. Silver. It hovered, sir. The major sighed, a sound of profound disappointment. He looked around the room, addressing the entire squadron. Gentlemen, we are flying at the limits of human endurance. The air is thin. The cold affects the circulation to the brain. Optical illusions are common. Sundogs. Reflections on the canopy. It is understandable. He turned his eyes back to Lucas. But we do not tell ghost stories in this mess. We are scientists of combat. If you cannot identify it, it is because you were not looking closely enough. Do you understand? Yes, sir, Lucas whispered, his face burning red. Good. Get some sleep. You're on the dawn patrol. The major turned and walked away. The conversation in the room slowly resumed, but it was forced. The tension remained. Peter looked at Lucas. The kid wasn't lying. Peter wanted to say something, to tell him I saw it too, but he didn't. He looked at the head table. The Baron was watching Lucas. He wasn't sneering like the major. He wasn't laughing. His expression was intense, predatory. He was looking at Lucas the way a hawk looks at a movement in the grass. That night, Peter couldn't sleep. The barracks were cold, and the snoring of the other men felt oppressive. He kept seeing that silver scar on the sky. He kept hearing Elias talking about the magnetized engines. It wasn't hypoxia. You couldn't hallucinate a magnetic field that made a wrench stick to an engine block. He pulled on his greatcoat and boots and walked out into the night. The airfield was shrouded in mist, the hangars looming like sleeping beasts. The ground was freezing hard, the mud turning into jagged ruts that crunched under his boots. He walked toward the operations hut, thinking he might find some brandy left over in the cupboard. The door to the hut was ajar. A sliver of yellow light spilled out onto the frost-covered ground. Peter hesitated. It was past midnight. The hut should have been empty. He pushed the door open quietly. Inside, the room was thick with cigarette smoke. A large map of the Western Front was pinned to the central table, illuminated by a single hanging bulb. Leaning over the map, still wearing his flight breeches and boots, was the Baron. He didn't look up when Peter entered. He was holding a red grease pencil, his hand hovering over a sector of the map that was deep behind German lines. It was an area of empty farmland, of no strategic importance. No trenches, no depots, no artillery parks, just open fields. "Sir?" Peter said softly. The Baron didn't startle. He had nerves of ice. He simply lowered the pencil and made a small, deliberate cross on the empty grid square. "Peter," he said. His voice was quiet, stripped of the command voice he used in the air. "You couldn't sleep either." "No, sir." "Is it the cold or the noise?" "Neither, sir. It's the quiet." The Baron straightened up. He looked exhausted. There were dark circles under his eyes, and his face was pale in the harsh electric light. He picked up a cigarette from the ashtray, the smoke curling up around his fingers. "The Major says the boy was hallucinating," the Baron said. "He says the human eye is easily fooled." "The Major doesn't fly, sir," Peter said, stepping closer to the table. "No, he doesn't." The Baron took a drag of the cigarette. "I saw it too, Peter." The admission hung in the air. The ace of aces, the greatest killer in the sky, admitting he had seen a ghost. "It was above us," the Baron continued, tracing the line of their patrol route on the map with his finger. "It was sitting at 14,000 feet. I felt it before I saw it. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. Do you know that feeling? When you were hunting a stag in the forest, and suddenly you realize the stag is not the prey. You are." "I saw it, sir," Peter said. "Silver, no wings, it vanished." "It didn't vanish," the Baron corrected him. He tapped the map right on the empty grid square he had marked. "It moved, faster than a bullet, faster than thought. I tracked it for a split second as it climbed. It went there, to this sector." Peter looked at the map. "There's nothing there, sir. Just fields." "Exactly," the Baron whispered. "It's watching us, Peter. It watched us kill the Englishman today. It sat there and watched like a scientist watching bacteria in a petri dish. It has no fear of us. It has no fear of our guns." He looked up at Peter, and for the first time, Peter saw something in the Baron's eyes that terrified him more than any British squadron. It wasn't fear. It was an obsession. It was the look of a man who had found the ultimate challenge. "Tomorrow," the Baron said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "We are going to go back up. We are going to find the British bombers, and we are going to start a fight. A big one. We will make enough noise and fire to draw the whole world's attention." "Sir? It is attracted to the conflict, Peter. It feeds on the energy of it. I can feel it." The Baron crushed his cigarette out on the table, leaving a smear of ash near the red cross. "We are going to lure it out, and when it comes back, I am going to catch it." "Catch it?" Peter asked, his stomach turning over. "Sir, if that thing is what I think it is, we can't fight it. Elias says the planes are already damaged. The magnetos. The machines will hold." The Baron snapped, his arrogance returning like a shield. "I am the master of this airspace. German, British, or whatever that is. Nothing flies in my sky without my permission." He looked back down at the map, at the empty square where the unknown waited. "Get some sleep, Peter. Tomorrow will be a busy day. We are going hunting." Peter left the hut, stepping back into the freezing mist. He looked up at the night sky, at the stars that glittered with a cold, indifferent light. He shivered, pulling his coat tighter. He knew the Baron was wrong. You don't hunt a storm. You don't hunt an earthquake. And you certainly don't hunt the thing that was waiting for them in the clouds. But he was a soldier, and when the sun rose, he would strap himself back into his fragile wooden chair, check his guns, and follow the red triplane into the abyss. As he walked back to the barracks, he heard a sound, faint, distant, coming from high above the cloud layer. It wasn't an engine. It was a hum, a low-frequency vibration that he felt in his teeth more than he heard with his ears. It lasted for 3 seconds, then faded. Peter didn't look up. He didn't want to know. He just walked faster, praying that the dawn would never come. The dawn did come, as it always does in war, gray, wet, and indifferent to whether you are alive to see it or not. I had managed perhaps an hour of fitful sleep, sitting upright in a chair in the corner of the barracks, my greatcoat pulled tight around my shoulders. Every time I drifted off, the silence of the dream would be shattered by that hum I had heard outside. That vibration that felt less like a sound, and more like a warning signal traveling through the bedrock of the earth. But when I woke, the only sound was the familiar, aggressive roar of the airfield waking up. Mechanics were shouting in German, hammers were striking metal, and the first engines were being turned over, coughing and sputtering as they chewed through the cold morning air. I walked to the hangar with a feeling of dread that settled deep in my stomach, a cold weight that had nothing to do with the temperature. The mist was thick, clinging to the ground like mustard gas, obscuring the far end of the runway. Through the haze, I could see the silhouette of the Baron's triplane. It was already out on the line, painted that blood-red color that made it visible for miles. It was a psychological weapon as much as a machine, a challenge thrown in the face of the British Empire. But today, as I looked at it, the red paint seemed dark, almost black in the low light. It looked like a bruise on the morning. Elias was standing by my albatros, wiping his hands on a rag that was so saturated with oil it probably made his hands dirtier. He looked exhausted, his eyes rimmed with red, his face smeared with grease. He had been up all night. "She's ready, Lieutenant," Elias said, his voice rough. I stripped the magnetos down to the brass, replaced the wiring. I even swapped out the spark plugs for a fresh set we stole from a 2-seater unit. "Did it help?" I asked, running a gloved hand along the smooth, varnished wood of the fuselage. The plane felt fragile this morning, like a toy made of balsa wood that a child might crush by accident. Elias spat into the mud. The static is gone. For now, the compass is holding true north. But I'll tell you this, I found burns on the intake manifold. Not heat burns. Electrical burns. Like someone took an arc welder to the inside of the casing. I filed them down, but I don't like it. Metal shouldn't scar like that. Just keep her running, Elias, I said, climbing up onto the wing. If the engine quits today, I don't think I'll be gliding back to our side of the lines. He looked at me, and for a moment, the mechanic's mask slipped. He looked scared. You be careful up there, Peter. The boys in the radio hut. They picked up that noise again about an hour ago. It wasn't coming from the British lines. It was coming from straight up. I nodded, stepping into the cockpit and sliding down into the wicker seat. The familiarity of the cockpit usually calmed me. The smell of leather and petrol, the array of dials, the twin Spandau machine guns mounted right in front of my face. But today, it felt like climbing into a coffin. I strapped myself in, tightening the harness until it dug into my shoulders. I checked the guns, pulling the charging handles, feeling the heavy mechanical clunk of the actions. They were real. They were steel and death. Whatever was out there, surely it could bleed if you hit it hard enough. The Baron briefed us right there on the flight line, shouting over the noise of the warming engines. He didn't look tired. He looked electrified. His eyes were wide, scanning the sky as if he expected the target to drop out of the clouds right then and there. The intelligence report is confirmed, he shouted, his voice cutting through the din. A squadron of British Handley Page bombers is forming up near Arras. They are escorted by Sopwiths. They will cross the lines at 10,000 feet. He paused, looking at each of us in turn. There were 5 of us flying this morning. The Flying Circus, the best hunters in the German army. We will intercept them, the Baron continued. But listen to me closely. We are not there to disperse them. We are not there to force them back. We are going to engage them hard. We are going to create a chaotic environment. We need noise. We need violence. Do you understand? The other pilots nodded, thinking he simply wanted to rack up more kills for the scoreboard. But I knew better. I met his eyes, and he gave me a barely perceptible nod. We were setting a table. The British bombers were the bait, and we were the lure, thrashing around in the water to attract the shark. We took off in formation, the wheels of our Albatros fighters bouncing violently over the frozen ruts of the airfield, until the wings bit into the air and lifted us clear of the mud. The climb was always a struggle. These machines were heavy with fuel and ammunition, and we had to circle the airfield twice to gain enough altitude to clear the trees. As we punched through the cloud layer at 6,000 feet, the world changed. The gray gloom of the ground disappeared, replaced by a blinding, pristine white floor of clouds and a sky of infinite blue. It was beautiful. It was always beautiful. And that was the lie of aerial warfare. You could forget, for a moment, that you were part of a machine designed to kill. We climbed for 20 minutes, the Mercedes engines screaming at full throttle. The cold began to bite. At 10,000 feet, it finds the gaps in your leather coat. It seeps through your gloves. It freezes the moisture in your nose. I huddled down behind the small windscreen, constantly checking my tail, checking the sun, checking the Baron. He was leading us in a wide arc, positioning us between the sun and the sector where the British were expected. And then, we saw them. They were specks at first, dark gnats against the white clouds below. The heavy bombers were lumbering shapes, slow and ugly, surrounded by the buzzing swarm of their fighter escorts. It was a massive formation. In a normal patrol, we might have hesitated. 5 against 20 was not good odds, even for Josta 11. But the Baron didn't hesitate. He rocked his wings, the signal to attack, and pushed the nose of his red triplane down. We dove. The wind screamed in the rigging wires, a high-pitched shriek that drowned out the engine. The speed built up rapidly. 100 miles per hour. 120. The vibration rattled my teeth. I focused on a British fighter, a Sopwith pup that was lagging slightly behind the formation. I had to do my job. I had to protect the Baron. The engagement began with the usual chaos. We fell upon them like hawks. I saw the Baron fire, his tracers streaking out like red fingers to touch the wing of a bomber. Smoke erupted from the British engine. The formation broke apart. It was a furball, a swirling, confused melee of turning planes, flashing machine guns, and the smoke of burning oil. I pulled my albatross into a tight turn, feeling the G-force press me down into the seat. A British plane flashed past my nose, so close I could see the pilot's scarf. I fired a short burst, the recoil of the Spandos, shaking the entire airframe, but I missed. I checked my 6 o'clock. Clear. I looked for the Baron. He was in the middle of the pack fighting 2 Englishmen at once, his red plane dancing through the air with an agility that seemed impossible. It was a textbook dogfight. Brutal, fast, and loud. The air was filled with the chatter of machine guns and the roar of 50 engines fighting for altitude. And then, the silence returned. It wasn't instant this time. It rolled over us like a tide. The sharp crack of the guns became muffled. The scream of the engines dulled to a distant drone. I felt that pressure in my ears again, that sickening drop in atmospheric pressure that made my head swim. I pulled out of my turn, leveling the wings. I looked around, expecting to see a new flight of enemy planes entering the fight. But the British weren't fighting. Directly in front of me, the Sopwith I had been chasing suddenly broke off. The pilot didn't turn to engage me. He didn't dive for safety. He simply pulled up and banked hard away from the center of the fight. I saw his head turning, looking not at me, but up. I looked down to my left. A Handley Page bomber, a massive beast of a plane with a crew of gunners, was banking so steeply it was almost inverted. The gunners weren't firing at us. They were clinging to their weapons, staring at the sky. The entire British squadron was scattering. They were fleeing in every direction, breaking formation, abandoning their mission. And they weren't running from the Red Baron. They were running from what was descending through the clouds above us. I looked up, and my heart stopped. It was back, the silver disc. But this time, it wasn't a distant speck. It was right on top of us. It must have been 300 feet across, a perfect, seamless circle of polished metal that reflected the chaotic scene below it like a distorted mirror. It didn't have the dull, riveted skin of our machines. It looked liquid, as if it had been poured into the sky rather than built. It was descending slowly, silently, right into the middle of the dogfight. The shadow it cast was enormous, plunging us into a sudden, terrifying twilight. The temperature in the cockpit seemed to drop 10 degrees in a second. I watched, paralyzed, as the object came to a halt in the center of the airspace we had just been fighting over. It hovered there, absolutely rock steady, ignoring the wind, ignoring the turbulence of the waking planes. It was an impossible thing. My brain tried to reject it. It tried to tell me it was a trick, a balloon, a cloud. But the sheer physical presence of it was undeniable. It hung there like a judge. Most of the German pilots were doing exactly what the British were doing, scattering. I saw Lucas dive his plane toward the ground, desperate to get away from the shadow. But the Baron didn't turn away. I saw the red triplane pull up. He was climbing. He was climbing straight toward the thing. "No," I whispered, the word lost in the muffled air. "Don't do it. but he was doing it. The Baron was attacking. I had a choice then. I could dive. I could run for the deck and pray that whatever God ruled the sky would let me live. Or I could follow my leader. I was his wingman. My job was to guard his back, even if he flew into the gates of hell. I cursed, I prayed, and I pulled back on the stick. My albatross groaned as I forced it into a climb, trailing smoke as I pushed the throttle to the stop. I fell in behind the Baron, perhaps 200 yards back and below. The red triplane looked like a toy insect approaching a silver dinner plate. The scale was terrifying. As we got closer, I could see that the surface of the object wasn't just reflecting light. It seemed to be rippling, like oil on water. There were no windows, no exhaust ports, no markings. The Baron closed to within 500 yards. He didn't waver. He lined up his shot with the cold precision of a master marksman. I saw the muzzle flashes from his twin Spandau machine guns. 2 streams of tracers erupted from the nose of his plane, streaking toward the silver hull. I waited for the impact. I waited for sparks, for ricochets, for the satisfying thud of lead on metal. But the bullets never touched it. 10 feet from the surface of the object, the tracers simply stopped. They didn't hit a wall. They didn't explode. They dissolved. One moment they were burning streaks of phosphorus and lead, and the next they were gone, turned into wisps of gray smoke that vanished instantly. It was as if the air around the object was an acid bath that consumed anything that entered it. The Baron didn't stop. He held the trigger down, emptying his ammunition belts into the void. He was screaming his defiance, I was sure of it, though I couldn't hear him. Then, the object reacted. It didn't fire back. It didn't launch a missile. It moved. 1 second, it was hovering directly in front of the Baron. The next split second, faster than a blink, faster than a shutter click, it was a mile to the right. It didn't accelerate. There was no ramp-up of speed. It simply ceased to exist at point A and instantly existed at point B. It defied inertia. If a human pilot had tried that maneuver, his body would have been turned to jelly against the cockpit walls. The G-forces would have torn a plane into matchsticks. But the disc just shifted, instantly, effortlessly. The Baron banked hard, trying to bring his nose around, trying to track the target. He was flying on instinct, reacting to a dogfight. But you cannot dogfight a ghost. The object shifted again. This time it was behind us. Above us. It was playing with us. It was the dragonfly, darting around a clumsy, slow-moving child. I saw the Baron's head swiveling, trying to keep track of it. He was furious. I could see the way he wrenched the controls. He was used to being the predator. He couldn't accept being the toy. The object stopped again, hovering directly above the Baron's plane. It was close now, so close I could see the reflection of the red triplane in its hull. Then, the light changed. The silver surface of the disc turned a deep, angry orange. It wasn't a reflection of the sun. It was an internal glow, pulsating from the center of the craft outward. The light was blinding, washing out the blue sky, bathing us in a sickly, amber radiance. And then, the sound died completely. My engine didn't sputter. It didn't cough. It just died. The propeller, which had been a blur of motion a second ago, windmilled to a halt. The vibration that had rattled my bones for the last hour vanished. I looked at the Baron. His propeller was stopped. I looked down. The British planes, fleeing miles below us. I could see their propellers slowing down too. Every internal combustion engine in the sky, German and British, had been silenced in the same heartbeat. The silence was absolute. The only sound was the wind rushing over the wires, a mournful whistling sigh. We were no longer pilots. We were passengers in falling kites. My stomach lurched as the heavy nose of the albatross dipped. Without power, the plane was a brick with wings. I pushed the stick forward to keep airspeed, trading altitude for life. I looked up one last time. The orange glow faded from the object. It hovered there for one more second, the undisputed master of the air. And then, with a sound like a cracking whip, a sonic boom that hit my chest like a hammer, it shot straight up. It didn't fly, it launched. It drew a vertical line of white vapor into the stratosphere and was gone in a heartbeat. It left a hole in the clouds above us. A perfect circle of clear sky punched through the vapor. We were alone. The glide back to Earth was the longest 10 minutes of my life. There is a terrifying intimacy to a dead stick landing. Without the noise of the engine, you hear everything. You hear the creaking of the wood. You hear the flapping of loose fabric. You hear your own breathing, ragged and fast. The squadron was scattered. I saw planes landing in fields, bouncing over hedgerows. I saw a British bomber crash land in no man's land, crumbling into a heap of wreckage as it hit a shell crater. But there was no fire, no explosion. The fuel wouldn't ignite. The spark was gone. I followed the Baron. He was a master glamor, gliding his triplane with impossibly delicate inputs. He aimed for a flat stretch of pasture a few miles behind our lines. I tucked in behind him, watching his wheels touch the grass. He bounced once, twice, and rolled to a stop near a line of poplars. I brought my albatross down 50 yards away. The landing was rough. I hit a furrow and the plane slewed sideways, the undercarriage collapsing with a sickening crunch of wood. The wingtip dug into the dirt, spinning the machine around until it came to rest facing the way we had come. I sat there for a moment, gripping the stick, shaking so hard I couldn't unbuckle my harness. The silence of the countryside was overwhelming. A cow was mooing in the distance. A church bell was ringing in a village. Normal sounds. Human sounds. I scrambled out of the cockpit, my legs giving way as I hit the ground. I fell into the grass, gasping for air, clutching handfuls of the cold, wet earth just to feel something solid. The Baron was already out of his plane. He wasn't looking at his machine. He wasn't checking for damage. He was standing by the wing, his hands on his hips, staring up at the empty blue sky where the hole in the clouds was slowly closing up. I stumbled over to him. "Sir," I croaked. My voice sounded foreign to me. "Sir, are you hit?" He didn't answer. He just kept staring up. I reached out and touched his shoulder. His leather coat was freezing cold. "Rittmeister, we need to move. We're in the open." He turned to look at me then. His face was pale, drained of blood, but his eyes were burning. He didn't look defeated. He looked like a man who had just seen the face of God and found it wanting. "Did you see it, Peter?" He whispered. "I saw it, sir. It killed the engines. All of them." "No," he said, shaking his head slowly. "Not that. Did you see the cockpit?" I stared at him. "Cockpit?" "Sir, it was smooth. There were no windows. When I passed under it," the Baron said, his voice trembling with a mixture of awe and horror. "Just before the light, the hull became transparent. Just for a second, I was close enough to touch it. I looked inside. He grabbed my lapel, pulling me close. I could smell the sweat and fear on him. There was no pilot, Peter. There were no seats. There were no controls. Then what? I asked, pulling back. Who was flying it? It wasn't empty, he whispered. It was full of light, liquid light, moving, shifting. It was alive, Peter. The machine itself, it was looking at me. And it was laughing. He let go of me and turned back to his plane. He ran his hand along the top wing, where the canvas was scorched black in a perfect geometric spiral pattern. He touched the blackened fabric, and then pulled his hand back as if he had been burned. "They aren't watching the war," the Baron said, his voice flat and final. "They're waiting for us to finish destroying ourselves." He started walking toward the road, toward the distant sound of a German staff car approaching. He didn't look back at the sky, but I did. And even though the blue was empty, I knew we weren't alone. The hum was gone, but the feeling remained. The feeling of being a bug on a slide, waiting for the giant to lower the microscope. And I knew, with a certainty that chilled my blood, that they would be back. They had tasted our fear now, and they liked the flavor. The staff car ride back to the aerodrome was a funeral procession without a corpse. The Baron sat in the front seat, his leather coat still covered in the mud of the pasture where we had landed. He didn't speak. He didn't look at the driver, a terrified corporal who kept glancing in the rearview mirror as if he expected the Red Baron to execute him for hitting a pothole. I sat in the back, shivering uncontrollably. It wasn't the cold anymore. It was the aftershock of adrenaline leaving the blood, that crash that leaves a man feeling hollowed out and brittle. We passed through the French countryside, the poplars standing like skeletal sentries along the road. Usually, this drive was a victory lap. We would pass infantry columns marching toward the front, and they would cheer when they saw the red insignia. They would wave their caps, shouting the Baron's name, believing that as long as he was in the sky, Germany was winning. But today, we passed a column of reserves moving up to the line, and the Baron didn't even turn his head. He stared straight ahead, his eyes fixed on a point in space that only he could see. He was already back up there. He was replaying those 10 seconds over and over again, trying to find the mistake, trying to find the tactical error that had turned the hunter into the prey. When we reached the airfield, the atmosphere had changed. The casual chaos of the mechanics and the relaxed camaraderie of the mess hall were gone. In their place was a wall of field gray. Field gendarmerie, military police, were stationed at the gate. They wore metal gorgets around their necks and carried rifles with fixed bayonets. They didn't salute the Baron. They stopped the car, checked our papers with agonizing slowness, and waved us through with suspicious glares. The aerodrome was in lockdown. The hangars were closed. The heavy doors slid shut and padlocked. Armed guards stood at every entrance. The surviving pilots from the morning patrol were nowhere to be seen. They had been herded into the operations building, separated and silenced. Major H was waiting for us. He stood on the steps of the command hut, his uniform immaculate, his boots polished to a mirror shine that seemed obscene compared to the mud-caked reality of the airfield. He watched us climb out of the car, his face tight with a mixture of fear and bureaucratic resolve. "Rittmeister," the major said, snapping a salute that felt more like a barrier than a greeting. "Lieutenant, you are to report to my office immediately. Do not speak to the ground crews. Do not speak to the other pilots. Since when does the intelligence officer command the squadron?" the Baron asked, his voice quiet but edged with dangerous steel. "Since the High Command received reports of a mass mechanical failure and the unauthorized retreat of an entire Josta," the major replied smoothly. "General Headquarters is asking questions, Baron. They want to know why the most elite unit in the air service fell out of the sky without firing a shot." "We fired," the Baron said, brushing past him. "The bullets just didn't work. We were separated immediately." The Baron was taken to the main briefing room, and I was led into a small, windowless office at the back of the hut. It smelled of stale tobacco and ink. I sat on a wooden stool for an hour, staring at a portrait of the Kaiser on the wall, listening to the muffled voices shouting in the next room. I tried to organize my thoughts. I tried to build a rational fortress around what I had seen. It was a reflection. It was a secret weapon. It was gas. But every time I closed my eyes, I saw that orange light pulsing. I felt the silence. When Major H finally entered the room, he looked tired. The veneer of the arrogant officer had cracked slightly. He sat down behind the desk, opened a file folder, and didn't look at me for a long time. He just arranged his pencils in a perfect row, tapping them against the wood. "Lieutenant Peter," he began, his voice measured. "I have the reports from the other pilots. Lucas, Von R. They are inconsistent. Lucas claims he saw a giant lantern. Von R claims it was a cloud that moved against the wind." "It wasn't a cloud, sir," I said. The major looked up sharply. "Then what was it?" "The British have been rumored to be working on an electromagnetic weapon. Something to disrupt ignitions. A Tesla device." "Sir, a Tesla device is a machine," I said, leaning forward. "It sits on a truck or a ship. It doesn't hover at 12,000 feet. It doesn't accelerate from 0 to Mach 2 in a heartbeat. And it certainly doesn't turn transparent." "Transparent?" The major's pen stopped moving. None of the others mentioned that. "The Baron saw it," I said. "He was closest." The major closed the file with a snap. "The Baron is under extreme stress. He has been flying combat sorties for 2 years without a break. The mind protects itself, Lieutenant. It invents monsters to explain failure. If you admit that a British machine defeated you, it is a tactical problem. If you claim it was a magic silver disc, it is a psychological problem." He leaned across the desk, his voice dropping to a hiss. "We cannot afford psychological problems. Not now. Not with the offensive starting. If word gets out that Josta 11 is seeing ghosts, the morale of the entire army collapses. Do you understand? You saw a British experimental aircraft. It used a magnetic pulse weapon. We will develop countermeasures. That is the official report." "And the silence?" I asked. "The way it moved? How do we develop countermeasures for physics we don't understand?" "You are dismissed, Lieutenant," the major said, turning his back to me. "Get some rest. You fly again tomorrow." I walked out of the office, my hands shaking. They were going to bury it. They were going to file it away in a cabinet marked enemy technology and send us back up to die. I needed to see the planes. I needed to know that I wasn't crazy. I waited until dusk. The guards were still at their posts, but they were infantrymen, bored and cold. They were watching the road, not the shadows between the buildings. I slipped behind the mess hall and made my way toward the maintenance hangars. The fog had returned, thicker than before, wrapping the airfield in a wet, suffocating blanket. It muffled my footsteps as I crossed the open ground. The main hangar door was locked, but I knew about the loose corrugated panel at the back, the one Elias used to sneak out for a smoke. I pried it open, the metal groaning softly, and squeezed through into the darkness. Inside, the air was heavy with the smell of ozone. It wasn't the usual smell of petrol and dope. It smelled like the air after a violent thunderstorm, sharp and metallic. A single electric bulb was burning in the far corner, casting long, distorted shadows across the floor. Under the light, stripped of its engine cowlings, sat the Baron's red triplane. Elias was there. He was sitting on a crate, staring at the engine block. He didn't jump when I approached. He just nodded, as if he had been expecting me. "I knew you'd come." Elias said quietly. The major took my logbook. He tore out the pages where I wrote down the instrument readings. "Show me," I said. Elias stood up and picked up a heavy steel wrench from his workbench. He walked over to the plane. "Watch." He held the wrench a foot away from the engine block. He let go. The wrench didn't fall. It snapped sideways, flying through the air with a metallic clack to slam against the cast iron of the engine cylinders. It stuck there, defying gravity, held by an invisible force. "The whole block," Elias whispered. "Pistons, cylinders, the prop shaft. It's all magnetized, powerfully. It's destroyed the timing gears. The metal has actually changed structure at the molecular level. I tried to file down a burr earlier, and the file skated off. The steel is harder than it should be. It's like it's been tempered by a heat we can't measure." I stepped closer, looking at the wings. The red canvas was usually smooth and tight as a drum. Now the upper wing looked diseased. "Look at the scorching," Elias said, pointing a flashlight at the fabric. The burns weren't random soot marks from an exhaust backfire. They were geometric, perfect, interlocking spirals that radiated out from the center of the wing. They looked like the patterns of frost on a window pane, but burned in black carbon. "I measured them," Elias said. "The spacing is mathematically perfect, down to the millimeter. Whatever hit this plane didn't just burn it. It scanned it. It mapped the internal structure." I ran my finger over the charred canvas. It crumbled at my touch, turning to a fine gray dust that felt greasy between my fingers. "It's not British, Elias," I said. "The British build tractors with wings. They don't build this." Elias looked around the empty hangar, then reached into the deep pocket of his grease-stained overalls. "I know, and they know it too." He pulled out a folded, crumpled piece of paper. It was stained with dried blood and oil. "I pulled this out of a wreck 3 weeks ago," Elias said. "A Sopwith that came down near the river. The pilot was dead. I was salvaging the instruments, and I found this tucked into his flight jacket. I didn't turn it in to the major. I thought it was just the ravings of a dying man, until today." He handed me the paper. I unfolded it carefully. The handwriting was shaky, written in pencil that had smeared in the damp. It was a letter, unfinished, addressed to a woman named Sarah in Leeds. I held it under the dim electric bulb and read. "We call them the silver plates. That's what Jenkins calls them anyway. High Command says they're German balloons, but balloons don't fly against the wind at 100 miles an hour. They watch us, Sarah. Every time we go up near the lens sector, they are there, hovering, waiting. Last Tuesday, Miller fired at one. He swears his bullets went right through it. When he landed, his gun barrels were melted. Not jammed, melted. Fused solid into a lump of steel. The mechanics are terrified. They say the planes come back smelling of ozone and sulfur. I don't think they are fighting for the Kaiser, Sarah. I think they are waiting for us to kill each other so they can take what's left." The letter ended there. The rest of the page was torn away, soaked in dark blood. I lowered the paper, my hands trembling. "The lens sector," I whispered. "That's 30 miles south." "They're moving north," Elias said. "Following the offensive. Following the bodies. Does the Baron know?" "The Baron knows everything," Elias said, taking the letter back and tucking it into his pocket. "He was here an hour ago. He didn't look at the engine. He didn't look at the burns. He just asked me for the camera." "The camera?" "The reconnaissance camera. The big Zeiss unit we mount on the 2-seaters. He took it. He said he had work to do." I left the hangar, my mind racing. The Baron had taken a camera. That meant he wasn't planning to shoot the thing down anymore. He was planning to prove it existed. He was planning to force the world to look at it. I found him in the photography hut, a small wooden shack near the edge of the airfield where the observers developed their aerial plates. The red light of the darkroom spilled out from under the door. I knocked, but there was no answer. I tried the handle. It was unlocked. The room smelled of acetic acid and fixer chemicals. Lines of wet photographs were hanging from strings dripping into the sinks. The Baron was standing over the developing tray, gently rocking it back and forth, watching an image emerge on the paper. He looked up as I entered. In the red light, his face looked demonic, the shadows carving deep hollows under his eyes. He didn't look angry that I had disturbed him. He looked vindicated. "Come here, Peter," he said, his voice a low rasp. "Look at what the Major calls a cloud." I walked over to the tray. The photo was large, high resolution, taken from a vertical angle. It showed the trench lines below, the jagged scars of no man's land, the craters looking like pockmarks on the skin of the earth. But floating above the trenches, clearly defined against the backdrop of mud, were shapes. Not one shape, 3. They were flying in a perfect triangular formation. Discs, metallic, featureless. They were positioned directly over the heaviest fighting, right above the sector where the artillery barrage was currently pounding the infantry to dust. "This was taken yesterday by a reconnaissance flight," the Baron said. "The observer didn't notice them. He was focused on the artillery park. But the camera sees what the eye ignores." He picked up a magnifying glass and held it over the wet print. "Look closely at the trailing edge of the formation." I leaned in, squinting through the glass. The grain of the photograph was sharp. I looked at the third disc in the formation. There was something trailing behind it. A thin, dark line, like a cable or a tether, hanging down toward the ground. And at the end of the tether, suspended hundreds of feet in the air, was a shape. It looked like a man. It was small, barely a speck, but the limbs were distinct. A human figure, dangling limply at the end of a line, being dragged through the sky behind the silver machine. "They aren't just watching, Peter," the Baron whispered, his breath hot on my ear. "They are fishing." I recoiled from the photo, bile rising in my throat. "Fishing? For what?" "For samples," the Baron said, dropping the magnifying glass onto the table with a clatter. "We are the specimens. The war is just the method they use to harvest us. Think about it. Thousands of men disappearing in the mud, missing in action, vaporized by artillery. We write the letters to the mothers. We tell them their sons were heroes, but maybe they were just collected." He grabbed the photo from the tray, water dripping onto the floor. "The Major wants to bury this. He wants to call it a British weapon. But I am going to show him this. I am going to slam this onto his desk and force him to admit that we are not the masters of this war." "Sir," I said, backing away toward the door, "if you do that, if you show them that, they won't believe you. They'll lock you up. They'll say you've lost your mind." "Let them try," the Baron snarled. "I am the Red Baron. I am the hero of the Empire. They cannot touch me." He was wrong. I could see it in the manic energy of his movements, in the way his hands shook as he held the dripping photograph. The institution of the army was stronger than any one man, even a hero. If he tried to expose this, they would destroy him. But there was something else. Something worse than the court-martial. "Sir," I said, stopping at the door, "if those things are collecting samples, and we engage them today, what makes you think they're done with us?" The Baron looked up, his eyes meeting mine in the red gloom. He smiled, a grim, humorless baring of teeth. "They aren't done, Peter. I looked into that cockpit. I saw the intelligence there. It recognized me. It knows who I am. And it knows that I am the alpha of this pack. He turned back to the photo, staring at the dangling figure. "They will come back," he said softly. "They have to, because I'm the one they want." I stepped out into the night. The fog had cleared slightly, revealing a patch of stars directly overhead. I looked up, searching for a silver gleam, for a shadow that blocked the starlight. The airfield was silent, but it was the silence of a held breath. The letter in Elias's pocket, the magnetized engine, the photo of the man on the hook, the pieces were coming together into a picture that was too large to comprehend. We were fighting for inches of mud, bleeding a generation white for the sake of borders that didn't matter, while above us, the gods were lowering their nets. I walked back to my barracks, but I didn't go inside. I sat on the steps, cleaning my pistol, checking the action over and over again. It was a useless gesture, a Luger against a spaceship, but it was all I had. Somewhere to the south, the artillery started up again, a low, rhythmic thumping that shook the ground. The harvest was continuing, and tomorrow, we would go back up into the slaughterhouse, not as soldiers, but as bait. I looked at the moon, rising pale and cold above the hangars, and for the first time in my life, I prayed for clouds. I prayed for a storm so violent that nothing could fly. Because if the sky was clear tomorrow, I knew we wouldn't be coming back. The Baron was right. They were fishing, and we had just swallowed the hook. My prayer for clouds was answered, but not in the way I had hoped. The next morning didn't bring a storm. It brought a sky that was so clear, so aggressively blue, that it felt like an insult. The sun burned off the ground fog by 0800, leaving the aerodrome exposed and naked. There was nowhere to hide. The mud had dried into a hard, cracked crust that crunched underfoot, and the wind had died completely. It was perfect flying weather. It was killing weather. The order came down from headquarters at 0900. Josta 11 was to launch a full-strength patrol immediately. The objective was simple: air superiority. We were to sweep the sector from Arras to Lens, engage any enemy aircraft, and secure the airspace for a new German offensive pushing toward Vimy Ridge. The order was signed by a general who was sitting in a chateau, 50 miles away, drinking coffee and looking at a map that didn't show the silver discs waiting in the stratosphere. The briefing was short. The Baron stood at the front of the room, his back to the chalkboard. He looked worse than he had the night before. His eyes were sunken, his skin pale and waxy. He hadn't slept. I knew he had spent the night in the photography hut, staring at that image of the dangling man, trying to make sense of a war that had suddenly become very small. But when he spoke, his voice was steady. It was the voice of the commander, the legend, the mask he wore to keep the rest of us from breaking. "Gentlemen," he said, tapping the map with a pointer, "we fly in 2 flights. I will lead the first flight at 12,000 feet. Lieutenant Peter will fly my wing. The second flight will fly top cover at 14,000 feet. Keep your eyes open. The British will be out in force today." He didn't mention the discs. He didn't mention the silence or the orange light. He didn't have to. Every man in that room knew what we were really looking for. I saw Lucas sitting in the back row, his hands shaking so badly he had to clasp them together on the table. He looked like a man walking to the gallows. We walked out to the planes in silence. The mechanics were already there, making final adjustments. Elias was standing by my Albatros, his face grim. He didn't say a word about the magnetos or the burns. He just handed me my flight goggles and gripped my shoulder for a second. A hard, desperate squeeze that said more than any speech. "Good luck, Lieutenant," he whispered. "Watch the temperature gauge. She's running hot." I climbed into the cockpit, the familiar routine feeling alien and wrong. I strapped in, checked the guns, and signaled the ground crew. The propeller spun, the engine caught with a roar, and the smell of castor oil filled my lungs. I looked over at the Baron. He was already rolling, his red triplane bouncing over the uneven ground. I pushed the throttle forward and followed him. The takeoff was smooth. We climbed in a tight spiral, gaining altitude over the shattered landscape of northern France. Below us, the trenches were jagged scars in the earth, filled with the smoke of the morning artillery barrage. I could see the flashes of the guns, tiny sparks of light that meant men were dying down there. But for the first time, I didn't pity the infantry. They were safe in the mud. They only had to worry about shrapnel and gas. We were flying into the domain of something that treated gravity like a suggestion. We reached 12,000 feet and leveled off. The air was thin and freezing, biting through my leather coat. I checked my 6 o'clock. The sky behind us was clear. I checked above. The second flight was in position, 5 Albatros fighters hanging like dark crosses against the blue. For 20 minutes, nothing happened. We patrolled the sector, flying in long, lazy figure eights. The sun was high now, casting short shadows on the wings. The drone of the engine was hypnotic, lulling me into a false sense of security. Maybe they were gone. Maybe it was a one-time event. Maybe the Baron was wrong. Then, the radio crackled. It wasn't a voice. It was static, a harsh, rhythmic pulsing sound that cut through my headset like a saw. It wasn't the random static of atmospheric interference. It was structured. Click, click, hiss. Click, click, hiss. I looked at the Baron. He was looking up. And there they were. They didn't descend slowly this time. They simply appeared. One moment the sky above the second flight was empty. The next, 3 silver discs were hanging there, perfectly spaced, perfectly still. They were lower today, perhaps only 1,000 feet above our top cover. The panic on the radio was immediate. Voices were shouting over each other, screaming warnings, calling for a break. "Bandits! High! 12 o'clock high! They're back! Oh God, they're back! Break! Break! Right!" The second flight disintegrated. The formation shattered as 5 pilots, consumed by terror, dove their planes in 5 different directions. They weren't fighting. They were fleeing. But the discs didn't chase them. They ignored the fleeing planes. They dropped. They fell like stones, plummeting 3,000 feet in a second to level off right in the middle of our formation. The sheer displacement of air hit us like a physical blow. My Albatros shuddered violently, the wings flexing as I fought to keep it level. One of the discs stopped directly in front of Lucas's plane. Lucas was flying on the left flank of the formation. I saw him pull up hard, trying to avoid a collision. His plane went vertical, stalling, hanging on its propeller for a heartbeat. The disc moved. It shifted sideways, matching Lucas's movement perfectly. It was blocking him. It was hurting him. Lucas fired. I saw the muzzle flashes from his guns. He was shooting at point-blank range, pouring lead into the silver hull. And just like before, the bullets dissolved. They turned into gray mist and vanished. Then, the disc did something new. A beam of light shot out from the underside of the craft. It wasn't the orange glow we had seen before. It was a pale, blue-white beam, solid and coherent, like a searchlight made of solid matter. It hit Lucas's plane. The Albatros didn't explode. It didn't catch fire. It stopped. The plane froze in midair. Its forward momentum killed instantly. The propeller stopped spinning. The fabric of the wings began to ripple, as if it were being battered by a high wind, but the plane itself was locked in place. I watched in horror as the beam seemed to pull. Lucas's plane began to rise. It was being lifted, tail first, drawn up toward the belly of the disc. I could see Lucas in the cockpit. He was thrashing against his harness, beating his fists against the sides of the fuselage. He was screaming, his mouth open in a silent wail of terror. "Help him!" I shouted into the radio, forgetting protocol. Forgetting everything but the sight of my friend being dragged into the sky. "Someone help him!" But no one could help. The other pilots were scattered, diving for the deck. Only the Baron remained. The red triplane banked hard, coming around in a tight turn. The Baron was diving toward Lucas, his guns blazing. He was trying to sever the beam, to break the connection. His tracers streaked through the air, passing right through the blue light without affecting it. The disc ignored him. It continued to lift Lucas's plane, drawing it closer and closer to the smooth silver hull. Then, a second disc appeared on the Baron's tail. It dropped out of nowhere, positioning itself right behind him. It didn't fire a beam, it simply nudged him. It moved forward, its leading edge touching the tail of the red triplane. The Baron's plane pitched forward violently. He fought the controls, correcting the skid, but the disc stayed with him. It was crowding him, pushing him, forcing him down. I realized then what was happening. They weren't just collecting samples. They were separating the herd. One was taking Lucas. The other was isolating the Baron. I had to do something. I couldn't save Lucas. He was already 50 feet below the hull of the first disc, his plane starting to crumble under the stress of the beam. But I could try to help the Baron. I pushed my throttle to the stop, ignoring the red line on the temperature gauge. I pulled the nose up, aiming for the disc that was chasing the Baron. I didn't fire. My guns were useless. I was going to ram it. It was a suicide run. I knew that. But the logic of survival had evaporated. All that was left was rage. Rage at these things that treated us like cattle. Rage at the silence. Rage at the way they broke the rules of our war. I closed the distance. 500 yards. 300. The silver surface filled my windscreen. I could see the reflection of my own plane rushing toward it. I braced myself for the impact, screaming a wordless battle cry. At the last possible second, the disc moved. It didn't shift sideways this time. It shifted up. It jumped 50 feet vertically, letting me pass underneath it. But as I passed, I felt it. A wave of heat so intense it singed my eyebrows. The air inside the cockpit turned into a blast furnace. My engine coughed, choked, and died. I was gliding again. I wrestled the controls, bringing the nose down, desperate to keep airspeed. I looked back. The first disc had finished its work. Lucas's plane was gone. There was no debris, no falling wreckage, just empty sky where an albatross had been a moment ago. The disc hovered for a second, then shot upward, vanishing into the blue with that same cracking sonic boom. The second disc, the one that had been chasing the Baron, was still there. It had stopped pushing him. It was hovering now, watching him as he spiraled down toward the ground. The Baron wasn't crashing. He was landing. He was putting his plane down in a field near the front lines, a desolate stretch of cratered mud between the German and British trenches. The disc waited until his wheels touched the ground. Then, it descended. It landed softly, silently, about 100 yards away from his stopped plane. It sat there in the mud, a gleaming alien monolith in the middle of the wasteland. I was too low to do anything. My engine was dead. I had to land. I aimed for a stretch of road about half a mile behind the German lines. I came in fast, bouncing hard, my landing gear collapsing as I hit a shell hole. The plane skidded to a halt in a cloud of dust and steam. I scrambled out of the wreckage, ignoring the pain in my bruised ribs. I ran toward the nearest trench line, sliding down into the mud next to a group of terrified infantrymen. They were staring over the parapet, their rifles forgotten in their hands. "Give me your binoculars," I shouted at a sergeant, grabbing the field glasses from around his neck. I scrambled up the firing step and looked through the lenses. The scene was surreal. The Baron's red triplane was sitting in the middle of no man's land, motionless. 100 yards away sat the silver disc. It was huge on the ground, towering over the landscape. And there, walking across the mud between them, was the Baron. He wasn't running. He wasn't hiding. He was walking upright, his leather coat flapping in the breeze, walking straight toward the machine. "What is he doing?" The sergeant whispered beside me. "Is he surrendering?" "No," I said, my voice trembling. "He's not surrendering." I watched as the Baron stopped about 20 feet from the disc. He stood there for a long moment, staring at the smooth, seamless hull. Then, a door opened. It didn't swing out. A section of the hull simply dissolved, fading away to reveal a dark, rectangular opening. A ramp extended down to the mud. Something stepped out. It wasn't a little green man. It wasn't a monster with tentacles. It was tall, thin, humanoid but elongated, as if stretched on a rack. It wore a suit that looked like the same liquid silver material as the ship. Its face was obscured by a helmet or a mask that was completely reflective. The figure stood at the bottom of the ramp. It didn't raise a weapon. It didn't speak. It just stood there, facing the greatest warrior the human race had produced. The Baron took a step forward, then another. He walked right up to the figure. He stood toe-to-toe with it, looking up into that reflective faceplate. I couldn't hear what was said. I couldn't see their expressions, but I saw the body language. The Baron pointed a finger at the figure's chest. He was arguing. He was shouting. He was demanding answers. The figure didn't move. It stood like a statue. Then, the Baron did something that made my breath catch in my throat. He reached for his holster. He pulled his Luger. He raised the pistol, aiming it point blank at the figure's head. "Don't," I whispered. "Don't do it." The figure raised a hand. A long, slender hand with too many fingers. It touched the barrel of the gun. The Baron froze. He stood there, rigid, as if turned to stone. The figure gently took the gun from his hand. It examined the weapon for a moment, turning it over, looking at it with what seemed like curiosity. Then, it crushed the pistol in its hand like it was made of foil, and dropped the twisted metal into the mud. The figure placed its hand on the Baron's shoulder. It wasn't an aggressive gesture. It looked paternal, condescending, like a parent calming a tantrum-throwing child. The Baron stumbled back. He fell to his knees in the mud. He looked up at the figure, his shoulders shaking. Was he crying? Was he laughing? From this distance, it was impossible to tell. The figure turned and walked back up the ramp. The opening in the hull sealed shut. The disc began to glow with that familiar orange light. It rose slowly, silently, lifting off the mud without disturbing a single blade of grass. It climbed to 100 feet, hovered for a second as if taking one last look, and then shot into the sky, vanishing in a blink. The Baron was left alone in the mud, kneeling in the shadow of his red plane. I lowered the binoculars, my hands numb. The sergeant beside me was crossing himself, muttering prayers. "What was that, sir?" he asked. "What in God's name was that?" "That," I said, handing him back the glasses, "was the end of the war. We just don't know it yet. I climbed out of the trench and started walking toward the crash site. I didn't care about the snipers. I didn't care about the artillery. I had to get to him. I had to know what he had seen in that reflective face. When I reached him, 20 minutes later, he was still kneeling. He was staring at the crushed remains of his pistol half buried in the mud. "Sir," I said softly. He looked up. His eyes were empty. The fire was gone. The arrogance was gone. All that was left was a terrible, hollow understanding. "They aren't fishing, Peter," he whispered, his voice cracking. "They're farming." "Farming?" "They told me," he said, looking back at the sky. They spoke into my mind. No words, just images, concepts. They showed me the earth. They showed me the war. It's a garden to them. They plant the seeds of conflict. They water it with technology. And when the crop is ripe, when the destruction is total, they harvest the energy, the fear, the death. It feeds them. He stood up slowly, wiping the mud from his knees. He looked at his red plane, the machine he had loved more than anything in the world. He looked at it with disgust. "We are just fertilizer, Peter. All of us. The British, the French, the Germans. We are just manure for their crop." He started walking back toward the German lines, leaving his plane behind. He didn't look back. "Come on," he said, his voice dead. "We have to write the report. We have to tell the major that Lucas died in a mid-air collision. We have to tell them the engine failed." "But sir," I said, running to catch up. "You can't just lie. You can't let them get away with this." He stopped and looked at me. A sad, tired smile touched his lips. "Get away with it," he laughed, a dry, rasping sound. "Peter, look around you. Look at the mud. Look at the bodies. They already have." He turned and walked away into the desolate landscape, a small, broken figure against the vast, indifferent sky. And as I watched him go, I realized that the Red Baron hadn't died in the air. He had died right there in the mud, killed by the truth. The man who walked away was just a ghost, waiting for his body to catch up. We walked back to the German lines like two ghosts returning to a world that no longer felt solid. The mud sucked at our boots, a wet, rhythmic sound that seemed to mock the silence ringing in my ears. We didn't speak. There was nothing to say. Words are tools for describing human things, tactics, hunger, fear, love. They are useless for describing the moment you realize your entire existence is nothing more than a biology experiment conducted by something that doesn't even hate you. Because to hate you, it would have to respect you. We found a field telephone in a forward observation bunker. The Baron ordered a car. His voice was flat, stripped of all the charismatic iron that had made him a legend. The soldiers in the bunker stared at him, at the mud caking his famous leather coat, at the empty holster where his Luger used to be. They wanted to cheer. They wanted to ask how many Englishmen he had shot down. But they didn't. They saw the look in his eyes, that 1,000-yard stare that usually takes years of trench warfare to acquire, achieved in a single morning, and they looked away. The ride back to the aerodrome was a blur of gray trees and gray sky. When we arrived, the cover-up had already begun. Major H met us at the gate, not with questions, but with a clipboard. He didn't ask what happened to the planes. He didn't ask about the silver discs or the silence. He simply handed the Baron a pen and a pre-written combat report. "Mid-air collision," the Major said, his voice crisp and loud enough for the nearby sentries to hear. "Lieutenant Lucas suffered a structural failure during a high-G maneuver. His fuel tank ruptured. Regrettable. A tragic accident due to pilot error and mechanical fatigue. The Baron took the pen. He looked at the paper, then at the Major, then at the sky. For a second, I thought he was going to tear it up. I thought he was going to scream the truth until the entire airfield heard him. But he didn't. He signed his name, Manfred von Richthofen. The signature was jagged, a scrawl of black ink that looked like a scar on the white paper. "And the engine failure?" the Baron asked softly. "Bad fuel," the Major replied, taking the clipboard back. "I have already ordered the fuel bowser to be drained and contaminated. We will receive a fresh shipment from Berlin tomorrow. The incident is closed." The incident was closed. Just like that. The bureaucracy of war had done what it always does. It had sanitized the impossible until it fit into a filing cabinet. Lucas wasn't a victim of an alien harvest. He was a statistic. The silver discs weren't hyper-advanced technology. They were a trick of the light and bad gasoline. I went to the hangar that night to find Elias. I expected to find him working, fixing the magnetos, trying to salvage the machines. But the hangar was dark. Elias was standing by the pot-bellied stove in the corner, holding a heavy sledgehammer. On the concrete floor in front of him lay the engine block of the Baron's triplane, the one that had been magnetized, the one with the impossible scorch marks. It was smashed into pieces. Cast iron shards were scattered everywhere. The pistons were bent, the cylinders cracked. "Elias," I said, stepping out of the shadows. "What have you done?" He didn't look at me. He swung the hammer again, bringing it down with a grunt of exertion, shattering the crankshaft. Sparks flew. "The Major ordered a refit," Elias said, his breath pluming in the cold air. "He told me the engine was scrap. He told me to make sure it couldn't be salvaged." He rested the hammer on the floor and looked at me. His face was streaked with soot and tears. "I tried to keep a piece, Peter. A valve stem. Just something small. To prove it was real." He opened his hand. A small, twisted piece of metal lay on his palm. It burned me. "It's been 3 hours, and it's still hot. It won't cool down. It hums, Peter. If I put it near my ear, I can hear them." He threw the piece of metal into the glowing coals of the stove. It didn't melt. It sat there in the fire, dark and heavy, refusing to change. "They aren't gone," Elias whispered. "They're just waiting for the next crop." The war continued. That is the horror of it. The sun rose, the artillery fired, and the men died. We went back up. We flew patrol after patrol, hunting the British, shooting down RE-8s and Sopwiths. But the Josta was different. The soul had been ripped out of it. We weren't knights of the air anymore. We were grim mechanics of death. We killed efficiently, without joy, without honor. We killed because we knew that if we stopped, the harvest would slow down, and maybe they would come back to speed it up. The Baron changed the most. Before that day, he had flown with a cold, tactical brilliance. He was a hunter. After that day, he flew like a man trying to provoke a god. He took risks that were suicidal. He flew lower, closer to the ground fire. He engaged larger formations single-handedly. He stopped painting victory marks on his tail. He spent his nights in the photography hut, but he never developed another picture. He just sat there in the dark. I think he was waiting for them to speak to him again. I think he missed the clarity of that telepathic intrusion. He had seen the truth of the world, that we were nothing but livestock, and he couldn't go back to pretending he was a hero. It took a year for him to die. A long, slow year of attrition. It happened on April 21st, 1918. We were flying over the Sami, near the village of Voxer Sami. The war had turned against us. The Americans had arrived. The fuel was bad. The rubber on our tires was synthetic and brittle, and the pilots were children who barely knew how to take off. We engaged a flight of Sopwith camels. It was a messy, low-level scrap. The Baron latched onto a novice pilot, a Canadian named May. It should have been an easy kill. The Baron was the ace of aces, with 80 victories. May was a rookie running for his life. I was flying top cover, watching the Baron dive. He chased the camel down to the treetops. It was a mistake. A rookie mistake. You never go that low over enemy lines. The ground fire is too thick. Pull up. I screamed into the slipstream, though I knew he couldn't hear me. Manfred, pull up! He didn't pull up. He kept diving. And then I saw it. He wasn't looking at the camel. I was only 500 feet above him. I could see his head clearly in the open cockpit. He wasn't looking through his gun sight. He wasn't leading the target. His head was tilted back. He was looking straight up. I looked up too. The sky was blue, empty. There were no clouds, no silver discs, no orange lights, just the indifferent sun. But the Baron saw something. I know he did. He was staring at the zenith with a look of rapturous attention, ignoring the machine guns rattling from the Australian trenches below. He was ignoring the Canadian captain diving on his tail. He was ignoring the war completely. A single bullet from the ground, or maybe from the plane behind him, it doesn't matter, struck him. I saw his head snap forward. The red triplane didn't explode. It didn't spin. It just tipped its nose down, weary and heavy, and settled into a beet field alongside the road from Corby to Bray. It didn't look like a crash. It looked like a resignation. I circled the wreck once. I saw the Australian infantry running toward the plane, cheering, waving their rifles. They thought they had killed the Red Baron. They thought they had won a great victory. I knew better. The Red Baron hadn't been shot down. He had simply stopped playing the game. He had seen the farmer coming to collect him, and he had gone willingly. The war ended 7 months later. The guns fell silent on the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month. We were told it was an armistice. We were told the world was safe for democracy. We burned the planes. We smashed the propellers. We walked away from the aerodromes and tried to become civilians again. Major H stayed in the service. He became efficient at a new kind of warfare, the war of paper and secrets. I saw him one last time in Berlin, in 1919, outside the Ministry of War. He was carrying a briefcase stuffed with files. "What happened to the report, Major?" I asked him, stopping him on the steps. "The real report. The photos." He looked at me, his eyes cold and dead, the eyes of a man who has sold his soul for order. "There were no photos, Peter. There were no discs. There was only stress and fatigue, and fire." "You burned them," I said. "I sanitized history," he replied. "Imagine if the world knew, Lieutenant. Imagine if the infantry knew that their sacrifice wasn't for the fatherland but for something else. Anarchy. Chaos. We gave them a hero in the Baron. We gave them a noble defeat. We gave them meaning. You should thank me." He walked away, vanishing into the gray crowd of a defeated city. I kept my diary. I kept the letter Elias had found, the one from the British pilot. I hid them in a tin box under the floorboards of my apartment. I got married. I had children. I worked as a clerk in a shipping office. I tried to forget the sound of the silence. But the harvest didn't stop. 20 years later, the world went mad again. A new war. Faster planes. Bigger bombs. The same mud. I was too old to fly, but I worked as an instructor for the Luftwaffe. I stood on the airfields and watched the young men go up in their Messerschmitts, knowing they were just fresh meat for the grinder. And then the reports started coming in. 1943. 1944. Pilots returning from night missions over the Rhine, shaking and pale. They talked about lights, orange orbs that followed their wings, silver shapes that danced through the bomber streams, immune to flak, immune to physics. The Americans called them Foo Fighters. The British called them Kraut fireballs. We called them nothing, because we were forbidden to speak of them. But I knew. One night, late in 1944, a young pilot named Franz came to my office. He was trembling. He told me he had engaged a B-17 bomber formation, and he had seen a silver disc hover over a burning city. He said he saw the smoke from the firestorm being sucked up into the craft. He said he felt like he was being watched by something that was laughing at him. "What are they, sir?" Franz asked me, his eyes wide with the same terror I had seen in Lucas's eyes 27 years before. "Are they American secret weapons?" I looked at him. I looked at the photo of the Red Baron that I kept on my desk. Not the propaganda photo, but a candid shot I had taken of him in the mud, staring at the sky. "No, Franz," I said softly. "They aren't American. They are the landlords, and the rent is due. I am an old man now. The wars are over, for me at least. I live on a small farm in the countryside, not far from where the aerodrome used to be. The mud is gone, covered by green grass and yellow wheat. The trenches are just depressions in the earth, softened by time. But sometimes, on clear nights in April, when the wind dies down and the silence stretches tight across the fields, I go out to the porch. I look up. I don't look at the moon. I look at the dark spaces between the stars. The farmers around here, they tell stories. They talk about strange lights in the summer. They talk about cattle mutilations, cows found dead in the fields, their blood drained, their organs removed with surgical precision, no tracks in the mud. They blame cults. They blame predators. I know what it is. The Baron was right. They are farming us. But they don't just harvest the war. They harvest the quiet too. They take samples. They check the stock. Last week I saw a light. It was hovering over the old sector near Vimy Ridge. It wasn't a satellite. It wasn't a plane. It was an amber pulse, silent and steady. It hung there for an hour, watching the sleeping world. I didn't run inside. I didn't call the police. I just sat in my chair and watched it back. I lit a cigarette, the same brand the Baron used to smoke, and I raised it in a toast to the darkness. We are arrogant creatures. We humans. We think we are the apex predators. We think we own the earth because we can draw lines on it and blow each other up. But we are just ants living in a garden we don't understand. We build our little hills, we fight our little wars, and we never look up to see the boot that is hovering over us. The Baron tried to warn us. He tried to shoot the boot. And in the end, he realized the only way to win was to stop fighting. So I sit here and I wait. I listen to the hum in the earth. And I wonder when the next harvest will be. Because looking at the news, looking at the new wars starting in the desert and the mountains, the crop is looking ripe again. And the farmers, they are always hungry.